When we sharpen our knives, if apexed properly, that's when both sharpened bevels meet up to form a point or apex in the middle. We almost always form some sort of a burr along the apex of the knife. The burr is a very thin piece of metal that forms along the apex that can be bent over to one side or the other, or it can even be standing straight up. And the super thin piece of metal is material that forms outside of the so-called sharpening triangle. If we viewed a perfect cross section, it would look like this. In reality, it looks more like this. So here's a look at the cutting edge cross section. You can see right here, I've actually filed a notch in the cutting edge and then sharpened the knife. And we formed a burr along our notch. You can see right here where the burr is folded over the notch on both sides. And you can also see a burr starting to form here and then get a little bit larger as we work our way up the blade. This burr is rolling towards the camera, sort of like a wave rolls towards you at the beach. So here's another view. The knife is actually angled away from the camera, but the burr is angled again towards the camera, just like a wave at the beach. And our burr is this line here, all the way down the cutting edge of the knife. Now the reality of burrs is that there's a handful of different kinds of burrs, as well as the fact that different steels at different hardness levels with different heat treatments will also form different types of burrs that will dictate what type of burr your knife forms. We can also get into sort of a semantics battle trying to distinguish what is or isn't a burr depending on how thin the geometry is on your knife. I mean, at what point does this ultra thin apex here become a burr? Now the good news is that none of this really matters for the vast majority of you. There's really only two things that we need to focus on here. And one is detecting if and when you formed a burr. The second one is how to remove that burr. Now, if you've apexed properly and you brought the two bevels together to form an exact point in the middle, you will have some sort of a burr along that apex. And this can greatly affect your edge retention. Now, the reason it's important to remove a burr is because a burr is actually pretty sharp on its own. When you take the knife off of the stone, if you have a burr on there, this burr is actually capable of cutting a lot of stuff. It'll actually be shaving sharp, and you can cut cardboard, you can cut all kinds of things with a burr, not the actual apex. All right, so here we have a knife. It is shaving sharp. It's pulling hairs off, and it will sort of cut paper. It's not fantastic, but most people would pick this knife up and say that it's sharp. And here's what that apex looks like. As you can see, we still have a burr along the apex. The problem is that this very thin extra piece of metal hanging off the apex isn't very strong. So the second you end up cutting something that's a little more difficult, this burr ends up folding over, and that makes your knife appear dull again. I can literally, yeah, that was it. I can actually tell the exact moment that it happened. So here we are looking at our wood blunted burr on a straight on view. This is from the top down, looking down onto the apex. And you can see right down here we have our burr folded over to this side. And as we work our way up the knife, you can see right here we have a blunted area. This is where the burr simply smashed down. And then we start to work our burr back over on this side again. So we are not forming a full-on point or apex. And again, the whole burr is folded over to this side. And then right here we have another blunted area. This type of an edge does not make for a very sharp knife. It makes for a knife that seems sharp in the very beginning, but ends up not being very sharp once you get into some slightly more difficult cutting tasks. This is why I think a lot of people believe that the sharper your knife is, the quicker it dulls. And what they're actually experiencing is that burr folding over the apex and dulling the knife. When in reality, if they had properly removed the burr in the first place, and had a nice clean point or apex on the edge of the blade rather than a extremely thin, weak piece of metal, we would have had much greater edge retention from the beginning. So let me show you how to detect whether or not you formed a burr, as well as how to remove that burr properly. So the first method that I'm going to show you on how to detect whether or not you formed a burr is to use your finger. Now, a burr will form on the top side of the blade. So if you're sharpening in this direction, the burr's going to form on the top side of the blade. If you're sharpening in this direction, the burr's going to form again on the top side of the blade. Now here's a real life example of this. We're sharpening on a power belt sander and we can see this burr form on the opposite side of the blade from the belt. So we can come straight off the stone and we can take our finger and rub it up the secondary bevel like so. And it's going to feel rough. It'll feel like there's a rough burr hanging over that side of the knife. And if you look close, you can just make out that burr hanging over towards the camera. That is what we are trying to feel for with our finger. Now, if we take our finger and rub it up the other side, it's going to feel smooth. You're not going to feel any roughness on that side because, again, the burr is rolled over this side of the knife. So we have smooth, rough. Now, the next best way to look for a burr is exactly that. Look for it using some sort of magnification. Now, the burrs on these knives, even coming off of the coarsest stone, are microscopic. You're going to have a very hard time seeing these with your naked eye. So, in my opinion, magnification is almost necessary at this point. And I would suggest getting a decent quality jeweler's loupe. Now, this is a very cheap one. These do work, but they're not going to be as nice as the nicer ones, and they're just not as durable as the nicer ones either. Now, there's two things that I would look for in a jeweler's loupe. One is get one with a built-in light that lights up the area that you're trying to view, as well as make sure you get the correct magnification. Get one that's at least 60 to 90x. The 10x versions are just not going to be powerful enough to view the burrs at the finer grits and even at the coarser grits. You really need at least a 60x, 90x is better. These things are extremely handy to tell what's going on the apex of the knife. And it will, once you get used to visually seeing what these burrs look like, transform your knife sharpening, and it'll just make you an overall better knife sharpener because you can actually see what it is that you're doing. What I'm going to do is show you an equivalent view of what the 60 to 90x looks like, what this burr looks like through one of these using my microscope. So this is an equivalent view of what you're looking for through a jeweler's loupe. So this is what looking through a 60x jeweler's loupe will approximately look like to you. And as you can see the burr just along the apex there. It is just enough to start to make out these burrs. Now keep in mind what you're seeing here is a little bit higher quality than you're probably going to see in real life because we are using very high quality optics. This is why I would recommend buying a better quality loupe, and that'll give you the better lenses and better quality optics and higher definition. Now this is about the 90x point of view that you're going to see here when looking through a jeweler's loupe, and again keep in mind it's a little bit higher quality than you're going to get in real life, which again is why I'd recommend a better quality loupe. Now, if all you can afford is an $8 to $10 loupe, then by all means it is definitely better than nothing. So now that we know what a burr is and how to identify one, how do we reduce or remove the burr in order to reveal that nice, clean, crisp apex? Well, I'm going to show you the method that I use for almost all of my knives. It's a really simple method that works very well for the vast majority of steels. Now, this is important because, like we said in the beginning, different types of steels at different hardness levels with different heat treatments form different types of burrs. And some of those steels can be extremely difficult to remove the burr from. Take this $1 knife from the dollar store example. This steel is very soft at around 54 HRC. It forms a pretty big burr, and that burr is fairly difficult to remove. Since the steel is so soft, it's kind of like a paper clip. You have to bend it back and forth 100 times before you end up reducing it or removing it completely. Now, another knife, for instance, like this really ugly test knife that I made several years ago, testing heat treatments. This is A2 tool steel at 64 HRC. Now this steel at this hardness level forms a much smaller burr in the first place, and the burr is removed much easier, only taking a handful of passes on our burr removal technique. So you're going to have to play around with this technique that I'm about to show you a little bit, depending on the type of steel and the hardness level that your particular knife is at. So the stone that I'm using here is a 400 grit diamond stone. This is a $20 stone. This is a very coarse edge. This is the worst case scenario for burr removal. Those coarse grit edges leave very large burrs, and they're fairly difficult to remove on cheap $1 steel like this. So this technique, when applied to finer stones with much higher quality steels, are going to give even better results than you're going to see here. So let's get started. Now the burr removal technique that I use for almost everything is the alternating forward passes into the stone with reducing pressure, and the reducing pressure is important. So we're going to place our knife on the stone. We formed a burr. We can feel it with our finger. And we're going to make alternating passes while at the same time reducing pressure to almost nothing. Now the amount of passes that it takes to fully remove this burr or reduce it as much as possible is again going to depend on the type of steel and the hardness level and the heat treatment that your particular knife has. It's just something that you're going to have to play around with in order to get right, which is again why it's so important to be able to visually see what it is that you're doing, and why I recommend the jeweler's loupe method as opposed to the feel it with your finger method. So we're just going to do some alternating passes here while reducing pressure. And we're doing this at the same angle that we sharpened at. Now reducing pressure as we are alternating passes here is important, and that's the key in my opinion, because if we continue using the same amount of pressure, all we're going to do is we're going to continue forming a new microscopic burr every time we flip the knife over. So as we reduce pressure, we are forming less and less of a burr until we get to a point where our burr is no longer forming and we are simply sharpening on the very apex. I hope that made sense, but you'll see this in a minute. And I can no longer feel a burr anywhere along the blade with my finger. Let's check it out and see what it looks like. So here's what our burr looked like in the beginning before our alternating passes. And here's what it looks like after our reduced pressure alternating passes. You can see that our burr is almost completely removed. We still have some scragglers hanging on, which we're going to move on to our next step and take care of those right now. So now that we have minimized and reduced our burr as much as possible on the stone, we can go ahead and move on to our strop. And this is going to further refine the edge and further remove all of those little pieces of burr that we can't get with the stone. Now I think the biggest mistake here is going too fine too soon. Now, I would recommend using diamond over something like chromium oxide. It is more expensive, but boy, is it worth it, in my opinion. I will never go back to solely using chromium oxide. As a matter of fact, I don't use it, and I probably won't ever use it again, as long as I have diamond on hand. In an emergency, yeah, let's use chromium oxide, but diamond for me all the way. Now back to I wouldn't go too fine too soon. Now if you're coming off of a stone less than 1000 grit, say you're coming off of a 400 grit or a 600 grit or an 800 grit, somewhere in that range, I would look into a 6 or 8 micron diamond strop. This is going to be aggressive enough to remove those larger burrs that you're going to have from these more aggressive stones. Now, yes, if you are coming off of say a 5000 or an 8000 grit stone, then yes, you can go right ahead and go to a 1 micron diamond strop. But if you go to 1 micron or half micron too soon, you're going to have a very difficult time removing these larger burrs. Now, our sharpening technique is not unlike I've taught here before. It is simply doing alternating backwards passes on the strop. Now for these larger burrs coming off of these coarser grit stones, you may need to do a lot more passes than you would think. Sometimes it really does take a lot of backwards passes on the strop in order to completely remove that burr. Now, in saying that, if you do find that you're sitting here for half an hour and you're still not removing the burr, then you need to go back to the stone and work on those alternating passes at reducing amounts of pressure in order to fully minimize that burr as much as possible before going to a strop. This is just the cleanup. This is not the important stuff is done on the stone. The strop is to just clean up that apex. So we've done a handful of alternating passes. Let's take a look and see what it looks like. So here's our apex after stropping on a 6 micron strop. And you can see we have pretty much no burr remaining along the apex of this blade. Now something else you can notice here is you can see these scratches going in a slightly different direction than our main scratch pattern. These are the 6 micron scratches from our strop. And these 6 micron particles are just enough to take the remaining burr off of the apex without further total refinement of our overall scratch pattern. So we're left with a very nice coarse grit edge with 0 burr. So this is how we can end up with a very coarse edge that is very sharp. So we've already surpassed the amount of wood we cut last time, and we are still absolute hair-popping sharp. I don't know if you can see this, but I mean, we are just popping right off the arm. And it's important to note that this is not an edge retention test. This is an apex stability test. And what this does is it tests to see whether or not that apex remains stable and it doesn't fold over to one side or the other, or we have a burr on there that folds over to one side or the other. This wood cutting test does not test edge retention. It tests apex stability. We're just clearing that up for anybody who may be asking. Now I know I'm gonna get a lot of people who ask, what about the wood burr removal process? You simply take a knife that has a burr, you grab yourself a piece of wood and run it through either the end grain or a cross grain to remove the burr. Well, let me show you how well that doesn't really work. So we've raised up a nice burr along this side of the knife. We're going to drag it through the wood, and I can feel the burr along the edge dragging through the wood. Now let me show you right now what this looks like. And you can see right here we have little tiny pieces of wood being drug out with the burr. It really doesn't have any effect on the burr itself. It is just way too strong to be removed simply pulling it through some wood end grain. If it's strong enough to hold up to a couple of cuts through wood, it's strong enough to be able to stand up to some light passes through some end grain or even some cross grain through the wood. So in the end, it really doesn't do a whole lot for the vast majority of burrs that are created when you are sharpening modern knife steels. So now that you know what a burr is and the proper steps to remove it, let me take you through a quick sharpening process to show you how to integrate it quickly and efficiently into your sharpening process. So we're going to form a burr with our dull knife. And remember, we're forming a burr when we bring both sides of the bevel to form an exact point in the middle. We sharpen past that a little bit, and that's what forms our burr. So now we've raised a small burr along the entire edge of our knife, and I can feel that with my finger. We can then work directly into our alternating passes on the stone. While we're doing our alternating passes, with each pass we're reducing our pressure onto the stone. Now I can no longer feel a burr with my finger on either side of the knife. We can use our jeweler's loupe here to inspect. And indeed, I can see that we've minimized the burr significantly. All we need to do now is go to the strop to remove that tiny little bit of remaining burr. And indeed, I can see we have no burr remaining on the apex of the knife, and it is extremely sharp. If you've liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Each picture that you've seen in this video took anywhere from 80 to 200 individual images to put together. It took me over 2 weeks to take all of the pictures that you saw in this video, so I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and subscribe button. And thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next video.